Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm looking forward to this next session and the number of distinguished guests we have participating today. We've had a chance to hear from our coalition partners, and now we will hear firsthand from members of Congress. I'd like to introduce Paul Wiedefeld, General Manager and CEO of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, to formally introduce our guests. Paul has led WMATA since 2015 and has served in the transportation industry for over 35 years. Please give Paul Wiedefeld a warm welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, David. And welcome to DC. I hope you had a chance to take a trip on the Metro Rail or our fine bus system while you've been here. So on behalf of APTA and the Washington Metro, it is my honor to introduce one of the strongest voices and advocates for transit in the United States. Congresswoman Norton, Eleanor Holmes Norton, represents Washington, D.C., which has she has over 40 Metro Rail stations and numerous bus routes serving hundreds of federal facilities, including the White House, Congress, and several major cabinets, departments, including USDOT and FTA. So you think your job is tough? We have some people looking at us every day, too. As a result of Congresswoman's strong appreciation, and she has a strong appreciation of the important role that transit plays in our communities. And as everyone knows here, Congresswoman chairs the House Transportation Subcommittee on Highways and Transit, which holds jurisdiction over our transit industry and is drafting both the infrastructure and the FAST Act reauthorization bills. So not only is Congresswoman the most prominent leader on public transportation in our country, but when WMATA needed it the most, she was there for us, leading the charge for safety funding in 2008 and continues to be one of Metro's strongest advocates in Congress. So thank you, Congresswoman. With that, please give Congresswoman Norton a big round of applause.
Thank you, Paul Wiedefeld, for that gracious introduction. It is a particular pleasure as chair of the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over public transportation, among other things, to be with you. And Paul, I think you were just the right man to introduce me, because in a very real sense, what Paul is doing with public transportation in the nation's capital is a model for what must be done with public transportation, which in many cities is in decline around the country. And part of it has to do, of course, with what Congress has not done. That is to say, with the absence, and I say absence because there's been a 20% decrease in funding in about 10 years, the absence of funding, and if I may say so, about competition from new modes of travel. So I'm going to speak just a bit about my priorities as chair of the subcommittee as we dig down to try to do something about reauthorization for 2020. You will recall that the Big Four, as we called ourselves, I was in the minority then, but this committee is perhaps the most bipartisan committee in Congress. I suppose there's no Democratic or Republican way to catch a subway. The result is that we were able to do a bill 5 years ago, but here was my regret. After working so hard and so well with my colleagues, in order to get any increase in funding for transportation and infrastructure in the greatest country in the United States, we had to reduce a 6-year bill to a 5-year bill. That's cheating public transportation. That's no new money. And so I confess as I begin this talk with some frustration. I'm not going to talk about money, though I have already done so. because Ways and Means is who must come up with the money. We are transportation and infrastructure. But let us stipulate that we cannot rebuild, and I use my words advisedly, public transportation, public transit and buses without money. The CBO, however, has documented that 20% decline. That's between 2003 and 2017. You know, in this country, we don't decline, we don't go down. But that is what has happened to federal spending on infrastructure, including transportation. But I have to tell you, if you only focus on one thing when it comes to public transportation, you won't be ready for the funding. Because funding is being rapidly displaced by brand new and compelling issues that were barely on our agenda when we passed the last reauthorization 5 years ago. And I'm talking about issues like climate change, technology, resilient construction, new modes of travel. I am particularly intrigued by climate change and technology as we approach this new reauthorization. And I should indicate why. I think that transit is unusually essential as a solution to climate change. For example, the electrification of buses can significantly decrease air pollution. Transit already puts fewer cars on the road, who are the main culprits. And we see more people looking for other modes of transportation, bike shares and scooters, emerging ways of transporting people that were just not on our agenda at the time of the last authorization. But there is something very serious going on in public transportation. The American Society of Civil Engineers, when it looks at our infrastructure overall, gives American infrastructure a D+. Bridges somehow managed to get a C+. But it also said that public transit needs more investment than any other part of infrastructure, and graded the condition of the nation's public transportation network with a D-. I think that kind of report card must wake us up during this reauthorization period. I'm glad you had Paul to introduce me, because we often focus on the largest of these systems to think about all the rest. And New York, Washington, and Boston are the three busiest systems in the nation, and they are in need of, by themselves, billions of dollars of repairs. And that is what Paul Wiedefeld has undertaken with Metro, with WMATA here in the District of Columbia. In a real sense, if the Congress had been doing its homework and oversight, we would be much more into the future rather than repairing the past. So, with these old systems, and yes, with some that are not so old, the focus on simply keeping them from falling apart shows us how far behind we are. So as I look at the 2020 reauthorization, I believe we must begin with modernization of existing systems and approaches to transportation. We've got to depend on those at the helm to fix what's there, and for God's sake, don't let us lose what is there. So I don't want to minimize that, but we can't afford to resist thinking of the future. For example, I mentioned climate change. We are paying too little attention to climate change. And those parts of our country that have a heavy hand on climate change have got to take the lead. Greenhouse emissions from transportation account for, and this is huge, almost 30% of greenhouse gases, replacing electricity generation as the number one contributor to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions just a few years ago. Passenger vehicles and freight trucks together account for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions within the transportation sector. All this does is wake us up to the larger role that public transit must play if we are to have even the smallest effect on climate change. That does mean more funding, robust funding, to increase technical assistance to transit agencies and to develop electric bus fleets that help mitigate U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Not long ago, actually we were in the minority, I signed a letter with the chairman of the full committee on capital investment grants because nothing was happening or was going too slow. The Trump administration seemed not to be getting the funds out that we had authorized. And I was concerned because these funds are important for a new generation of public transportation. I'm talking about the capital investment grants, which are discretionary grants to fund transit capital investments. I'm not here saying that with passenger modes of transportation, which have always needed subsidies, that the industry can do it by itself. I'm very concerned. Again, we wrote this letter when we were in the minority, that these funds, which could be used for commuter rail, light rail, streetcars, and bus rapid transit, simply weren't getting out of the Congress, even though we had authorized them. The administration had slowed them. Chairman DeFazio and I sent a letter, and we plan to, now that we're in the majority, to dig down deeper on funds that are available, which would give the industry a real head start. So I have particular concerns about public transportation in particular, and have looked more deeply into it. For example, what most concerns me is the reduction in ridership. Now, you can look at that in a number of ways because it's across the board. If you look at the millennials, they are very Uber savvy, and they are quickest and first to use other modes of transportation. They don't have the affinity to public transportation that their fathers and grandfathers had. These millennials, watch out, because there are a lot of them. And they are shunning car ownership. So that ought to be good for us in public transit. It's not showing up the way it should, because transit ridership is down across the United States in a period coinciding with the decline of our infrastructure in the first place and the rise of alternatives such as Uber and Lyft, bike sharing, electric scooters. Now, I'm not suggesting that people like me are going to get on electric scooters. Not now, not today. But I am suggesting that we have got to prepare for the future, not just look at transit as it is today. It is shifting under our feet as I speak. I look at buses. If you want to talk about public transportation that has been neglected, let us start with buses. We need to increase the amount of federal funds available for buses generally, but especially to help transit agencies like those in this room, represented by those in this room, invest in what we call no-low buses. With that stands for no or low emissions. If, as I believe, we ought to be more dependent on buses, then we've got to be more sensitive to climate change issues. More funds available for electrification of bus fleets, for example. Bus rapid transit, I'm a fan of bus rapid transit, which is high-frequency buses, which have dedicated bus lanes and traffic signal management to go along with them, which have begun in some cities who are taking the leadership. I recognize that now that the usual modes of transportation are not exclusive, we have got to integrate all the new modes of transit with what we do today, and that involves technology that can be used to coordinate service availability for subways, buses, and all the rest. Now, the drop in ridership, to switch from buses for a moment, and rapid transit, such as those we have in our big cities, like the district, is perhaps most troublesome, because that's where we'd like to see the pickup start, not end. If you look at Los Angeles, and its metro fell to the lowest level in more than a decade last year, you would think that Los Angeles, with those roads, that everybody would want to get on the metro. We have got to look more closely at how we make metros, subways, more attractive. Now, this happened in Los Angeles despite a booming economy and a growing population. So as the population grows, people don't automatically go on to rapid transit. And this is happening in other cities as well. In my own city, we see another phenomenon, and that's a switch from going to work from 9 to 5. Our own federal government says you can stay home and work. And we have people going to work at very different hours. We have tried to keep open our own subway system here to accommodate them, but we're part of a regional system, and that has been very difficult to do in light of the cost. Cities across the United States, including cities like New York and Chicago, these are bellwether cities, have lost bus riders as well. So here you have it. You lose your bus riders, you use your subway riders, they're getting there. And we've got to ask ourselves, what are they using, and how can we make sure that they use public transit? And so we're looking at things we're not on, we're not on our lips. We didn't know anything about in the last reauthorization, like micro transit, and we're looking at micro transit as a way of extending travel options, for example, to the underserved, into off-hour travel times. Washington, Los Angeles, and Detroit are looking at flexible route and on-demand micro transit. Now, I mean, whoever heard of on-demand public transportation? You know, you wait for it, you get on it when it comes. No, no longer. People are being understanding that the customer now can say, even to the biggest systems, we're just not going to use you unless you conform to us instead of our conforming to you. In DC, we have just taken our so-called circulator, this is a short-term bus, and made it free. It connects with other forms of transportation, so we think that will pay off. Data-driven pop-in or pop-up transit services are being experimented across the United States. Now, sometimes, because they are new, they have failed to generate ridership. And many in the profession say that these kinds of data-driven services will be difficult because they are popping up without public subsidies. Recent declines in bus and rail nationwide, however, have given regional transportation systems a greater sense of urgency for the need to experiment, to look at what the public is using and what the public is demanding, and to at least try to conform. Some have seen increased ridership with this experimentation. It is worth doing what some call on-demand transit services, as long as they are affordable. It all comes down to expanding services while keeping them both accessible and affordable, which is something our sector has not had to do before. Cities are using systems that may rely on vehicles larger than a personal automobile, but smaller than a city bus, as well as routes that can be adjusted based on where the passengers are located and where they need to go, not where the public transportation wants to go. Here in the nation's capital, there's a vision of micro-transit systems that touch all neighborhoods. We're building on a 2-year-old program called Neighborhood Ride Service by Taxis, which was started to eliminate mobility barriers in what we call transportation deserts. We find that these kinds of micro-transit services are particularly attractive to concentrations of seniors and among night shift workers who are often left behind by public transportation. It's important to note that the most cited barrier to increased transit uses are bus speeds. Before I looked closely at this, I had not recognized that. Buses are seen by some as simply too slow for what they need to do and where they need to get. The common response when people were asked about this was that they wanted more service. A staff report here showed the most effective way to attract riders back to our own Metro bus is by a series of service improvements. And these improvements include dedicated bus lanes, all-door boarding, off-board fare payment, like you do on Metro, and increasing limited stop service. For example, we found that for every 10%, that's right here, and this is a huge system, for every 10% in average bus speeds on a corridor, ridership was expected to rise by between 4% and 10%. So we've got to look at more than the vehicle itself, or more than the street on which the vehicle travels. I'm very interested in rapid bus transit, high-speed bus systems in which buses travel on dedicated routes to attract people back to buses. Bus rapid transit, as it's called, and I've looked at this worldwide, have been very useful in other countries. They are already in use in some parts of the United States. So when we look at transportation, we've got to look as well at traffic safety improvements, dedicated bus lanes, interaction between buses and other vehicles, to be sure. We believe that this is done, we will reduce, among other things, the increase in accidents. Now, I'm not suggesting that wholesale reauthorization can take place, wholesale modernization can take place in one reauthorization. But I am suggesting that the new reauthorization in 2020 must be seen as an opportunity to revolutionize our own thinking so that we use precious funding, whatever it is we get, for the future and not only to save us from our own past. Thank you very much.